Mode.
Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for being a part of today's webinar on the Standard Sales Tax Definitions Project, a briefing. Just a couple of quick items before we begin. We will be recording this webinar, so if you have colleagues or others who may be interested in it or you want to refer to it again on your own, we will post it to the CML website afterward, so it will be available to you. Those of you who are elected officials, you will get a Muniversity credit for participating in today's webinar. And also wanted to mention the fall district meetings are now scheduled, and we are taking RSVPs for those, so please visit cml.org/outreach. That's where you'll find the list of all of our district meetings, the dates, the schedule, and the location. Special thanks go out to all of our district chairs for hosting as well. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Allen, our CML staff attorney, and Jeff Wilson, our CML general counsel. And again, thank you so much for being a part of today's webinar.
Hi, everybody. This is Rachel Allen at CML.
Hi, I'm Jeff Wilson, everybody.
And Jeff and I were just joking, we've never had this many people sign up for one of our webinars, and it's about sales tax. So we're wondering what's going on up there. I mean, we think it must be the presenters.
Yeah, it couldn't be the material. I'll say that.
And so before we get started, I want to do a couple of things for housekeeping. And of course, I'm a lawyer, so I have to do a disclaimer. The first disclaimer is that we've got 100 home rule municipalities in Colorado. 69 of these municipalities collect their own tax. And this webinar is directly applicable to those nearly 70 municipalities that are home rule and collect their own tax. If you're from a statutory jurisdiction, or if you're from one of the home rule municipalities that doesn't collect their own tax, feel free to stay on the line. If you're an attorney, you can get CLE credit. If you're an elected official, you can get a Muniversity elected officials training credit. Or if you just like to hear about a long-term initiative that the league has been involved in, stay on the line. Otherwise, if you're from one of those home rule jurisdictions that doesn't collect their own tax, you can hang up. If you're from a statutory jurisdiction, and again, the state collects your tax, you can hang up. This isn't directly applicable to you. We're happy to have you, but by no means do we want to bore you or interrupt your lunch if this isn't directly applicable to you.
Well, hi, everybody. It's Jeff Wilson. I'm going to start out with a little bit of background information on the sales tax, both substantively and politically. I'm going to go pretty quick and then hand it off to Rachel.
Jeff, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I'm getting a couple of notes here that I've still got some housekeeping measures to address. If you have questions as we're going along, feel free to type them into the text box on the right-hand side of the tool, tool column on your screen. The other thing is that there's a couple of handouts also posted in that little tool column on your screen, and the couple of handouts are the CLE affidavit. If you are an attorney, this has been accredited for one general CLE credit. You can download the affidavit from the looks like it's called handouts box on the right hand side of your screen, and or you can just go to the website, which is cletrack.com, and you can enter in the course number, which is 749671. The other handout that's on the right hand side of your screen in that kind of toolbox column is a newsletter article Jeff and I put together back in May. So if you'll download the May newsletter, it's on page 3 is that article, and again, that'll provide an overview of this big project we've been working on. All right, sorry to interrupt, Jeff.
No, that's
back
okay.
to you. Back to background.
Okay. So anyway, I'm going to provide some background for Rachel when she gets to describing this project that she and her team have been working long and hard on for all these past months since December of last year. Okay, to the first slide. First, to illustrate the significance of the sales tax to Colorado municipalities, on average, we receive 73% of our general purpose tax revenues from the sales tax, and this really distinguishes Colorado municipalities from those in most other states. In most other states, the municipalities get over 50% of their money from the property tax. So when our sales tax comes in for criticism, I'm always pointing out how rough it'd be if we ran the cities off property tax in this state. We've got a very good tax system for us, and it's one also that I'm always quick to mention is pretty well received by the taxpayers. We have trouble with the business community from time to time, but those who actually pay the tax, poll after poll shows the sales tax faring better among taxpayers than, say, the property tax or the income tax. In Colorado, statutory municipalities, mostly towns, have their taxes collected by the Department of Revenue. And the Department of Revenue handles all the base. The base is defined by the General Assembly. The collection and auditing is done by the Department of Revenue. And the Department of Revenue shares back the revenue with the home rule jurisdictions. As Rachel mentioned, 69 home rule jurisdictions exercise their constitutional authority to locally collect their sales tax. And that means that these jurisdictions can define their own tax base. They can define how those tax base elements and exemptions are defined. They handle their own collection. Vendors are required to remit tax directly to the municipality, not to the state. And then the municipality handles all the auditing as well for all of the vendors doing business in the jurisdiction. As I indicate on that slide, close to well over 90%, I don't remember the exact statistic, of the municipal sales tax collected in Colorado is collected by these home rule jurisdictions. Local collection is a major reason why jurisdictions go to home rule. As a matter of fact, we've seen, especially in the post-Tabor era, jurisdictions going to local collection of their sales tax, but wanting to do that without a Tabor election, so they don't change the tax rate or the tax base. And these jurisdictions pretty routinely see an increase in revenue just by virtue of going to local auditing. So it continues to be a very appealing dimension of home rule status in Colorado. A lot of the issues that we deal with are because Colorado's system is somewhat unique. In most states, the sales tax, if there is a sales tax for local governments, is collected by the state and shared back, like it is for counties and statutory municipalities here in Colorado. Now on to the political issues around our tax system, because those are the context in which this project that we've got going now arises. The difficulties and the controversy about our tax system always arise around certain issues, and I've listed them here on this slide. Businesses that are engaged in business in multiple jurisdictions are subject to audit by each of those jurisdictions. These audits can be somewhat of a dislocation in their business. Teams of auditors descend on the business, and the business spends time accommodating the auditors as well as trying to sell whatever product or service they're doing. Additionally, and again, most of these issues arise with multi-jurisdictional retailers. Of course, a retailer that exists in only one jurisdiction doesn't have to worry about what the tax practices of the neighboring jurisdiction are. But for multiple jurisdiction vendors, they also have to remit to multiple jurisdictions. If you do business in Thornton, North Glen, Arvada, and Westminster, you need to have a tax license and remit tax to each of those jurisdictions for the sales completed in those jurisdictions or deliveries made to those jurisdictions. And that leads to the next issue. Over the years, as boundaries on municipalities change through annexation and we end up with portions of municipalities that don't line up with zip codes and so on and so forth, there have been businesses have complained about difficulty knowing which jurisdiction they're in when they're making a delivery. We've addressed this to a very large degree, as I'll get to in a minute, but this has been one of the complaints. And then the business remits to the wrong jurisdiction, gets stung in an audit, and in the worst case, the refund period with the jurisdiction improperly paid has run. So we have a vendor that didn't mean to do anything wrong having to pay twice. That's politically a problem. Then finally, base variations. This one isn't as big a deal as some of the others, but if you're a vendor that is affected by a definitional variation, say if the definition of hospital supplies, If there are variations between jurisdictions in how hospital supplies are defined, then tug depressors are exempt in one jurisdiction and taxable in another under the very same term. So you can imagine that's pretty chaotic. All of these things have generated constant controversy over my term here at the League since 1987. Indeed, one of the first things I had to do when I got hired as a staff attorney back in '87 was file a title challenge in the Colorado Supreme Court to a proposed ballot issue that would have required home rule sales taxes to be centrally collected, locally shared on the state base, loss of local auditing, and so on and so forth. So this has really been with me all of my career here at the League, which proves I must have been some kind of a jerk in a prior life, I'll tell you that. Going on to the next slide, a CML's position on this sales tax thing has been, it's our main revenue stream. It's hard to think of an issue that's more important than where the money comes from. And because of that, we view it as our job here at the League to stay ahead of these issues. In our world, if you don't lead, you follow. If you allow a political vacuum to exist, it will be filled. If we don't fill it, somebody else will. So we've always tried to be proactive. Whenever our friends in the business community or our municipal tax professionals bring to our attention something that's really messed up in the tax system that we can fix, something that's reasonable, and by reasonable I mean we don't take a bath financially by fixing it, then we think it's our public trust responsibility to fix it. It's hard to make an argument for maintaining unnecessary complexity in an already complex tax system. Finally, part of this has been, and I've worked on this really aggressively for my career, making sure that the door is always open to the business community. Instead of running a bill at the Capitol, come and see me. Let's find out what kind of problem we've got. Is it a people problem or is it a systemic tax problem? I want to give those guys a way to let the steam off of the kettle rather than getting together all mad at us at once and running a constitutional amendment. And the result of this, we're real proud of, and it's the next slide. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but these are just some things that we've done with the business community over the years. Standardized definitions of food so that we didn't have conflicts with the state over the WIC and food stamp programs. We did a standard definition of telecommunications service back in 1991. As I alluded to earlier, in '92 we did a standardization of the definitions project, and this one that we're doing now is in many ways similar to that, but it's an improved version, as Rachel will discuss. I mentioned earlier that complaints from the business community about whether they're in Thornton or North Glen or wherever, we worked with the Department of Revenue to get some address locators approved for use by vendors in Colorado. These allow vendors to know precisely which jurisdiction they're in when they're making the delivery. And in many jurisdictions, the vendor is held harmless for any errors in the database that result in a wrongful remittance. Rachel recently worked real hard with our sales tax professionals on a standard exempt purchaser affidavit. This was at the behest of the grocery stores and other retailers who were being presented with all sorts of different paper by folks from nonprofit organizations and charities claiming the right to purchase stuff tax-free. And the retailers were claiming they couldn't tell whether this stuff was legitimate or something somebody was making up in their basement. So we finally arrived at a uniform form, and it's really been well received all the way across our membership and with the business community.
And with the state. The state also adopted our form.
That's right. So we're real proud of that. Now, political activity at the Capitol. This is, I'm going to blaze through this, but we've had quite a bit. Like I said, our tax system is constantly controversial, and it's a constant political management job for us. In 2013, we had complaints from Representative Kathleen Conti from Littleton, former state representative, and some others about our tax system. Representative Conti was getting ready to run a bill for state collection, local share, the whole thing, everything we don't like. And we were able to deter that, but the result was House Bill 1288, which asked the Department of Revenue to study whether it was practical to develop a uniform state and local sales tax base. And CML supported that bill, not because we support a state and local uniform tax base necessarily, but we had insisted that the tax base be revenue neutral for both the state and the local governments. And we were pretty sure that the conclusion of the 1288 study would be that that was completely impractical. Why? Because the state has given, scores of tax breaks over the years to various special interests that we have not at the local level, and the state would have to repeal a lot of those exemptions and irritate a lot of special interests in order to make a uniform base. So that went nowhere. The 1288 report concluded, to no one's real surprise, that it wasn't practical, but suggested that uniform definitions were where the real value in terms of tax simplification could be found. In 2014, there was considerable activity on a referred constitutional amendment to require everybody to use standardized definitions and uniform tax guidance. In the post-Tabor era, tax guidance has also become important. You can have the same two jurisdictions that have the same words on the page, but tax guidance can result in a different application in the field. So a true standardization involves addressing tax guidance as well as the ordinance language itself. There was a lot of activity on a constitutional amendment to get that done. The CML Executive Board supported that effort. But after a lot of meetings, the development of this referred constitutional amendment became extremely complicated, both substantively and politically. And so without going into a lot of detail on what all happened there, it didn't happen. And what happened instead was the General Assembly approved Senate Joint Resolution 38, which asks us, CML, to basically reprise our 92 project, come up with standardized definitions, address the tax policy issue that I mentioned a moment ago, and most importantly, try and maintain standardization over time. This is something we didn't really do in 92, and we've got to figure out how to do this time around, and it's a challenging part of the project, I'll tell you. We supported SJR 38 as well, and that really has been the genesis of a lot of Rachel's project. Then last session, so SJR 38 started. In December, Rachel started having meetings with her group, which she'll talk about here in a minute. And we went into the session. Well, all session long, there was no activity on sales tax, except we kept hearing about this group of tax people that were real unhappy about our tax system, not the regular business community that we've been working with all these years, but some other folks. And we heard they were going to run a bill, and sure enough, right at the end of the session, this group, Simplify Colorado Taxes, you can go online and check out their website. They ran a late bill on tax appeal bonds and deposits. This bill was killed. It'll be back next year, and we're working with the proponents right now. It proposes to get rid of some bonds and deposits incident to appeals to district court. And then as well as, that was, I think, Senate Bill 279, as well, Representative Conti ran the constitutional amendment that we had all been working on, but of course she took out the piece that required it to be revenue neutral. It's really easy to do tax simplification if you just screw the cities. And that was, fortunately, we really had fun. That had to go away in a hurry, and it did. While all this was going on in the Colorado legislature down in Arizona, where they have a somewhat less advantageous tax system from a local government point of view, but they've traditionally had considerable authority at the local level in terms of base definition and collection. The difference in Arizona is that their system is not constitutionally based. Theirs is at the will of the General Assembly, and we saw last year they really got hosed down in Arizona. They lost local collection, they lost local audit authority, and they lost control of the tax base. I think the loss of control of their tax base was a year ago. So they have really, there's a real object lesson down in Arizona of how glad we are that we have our tax authority protected by the Home Rule Amendment. As far as 2016 is concerned, like I mentioned, we're going to have this little bill on bonds and appeals. Doesn't touch our jeopardy assessment authority, by the way. That bill may not end up being a big problem, but we do expect this Simplify Colorado Taxes group to mount some sort of major legislative attack on our tax authority. They've been having all these stakeholder meetings where they seem mostly focused on getting a bunch of people who are mad as hell in a room to all tell their stories about how they got messed around by their local government. There hasn't been a lot of conversation yet about what to do about it. And that has all the earmarks of a group getting ready to come down and make a big show at the Capitol. So we're getting ready for that. I'd love to be wrong about that. I'd love to find out that I'm being paranoid, but hey, I get paid to be paranoid. So I'm going to wind up talking about just a little bit of the legal background here and then turn it over to Rachel. As our attorneys on the line, I'm sure know, the Colorado Supreme Court, this is one area where home rule authority has been pretty strong over the years and remains pretty strong. The Supreme Court in 1998 in Winslow v. Denver, in a case involving the taxability of construction equipment being used at the DIA construction site, Supreme Court reaffirmed that most matters relating to local sales tax by home rule municipalities is a matter of local and municipal concern. And our authority supersedes that actions of the General Assembly in conflict, as you all know. In Winslow, the Supreme Court was reaffirming a couple of earlier cases called Berman v. Denver and Security Life versus Temple, which you'll find cited in the Winslow case if you look at it. The one exception, the one area where we've gotten nicked a little in terms of our home rule tax authority is in the area of tax appeals. In Walgreens versus Charnes, the court first held that in these matters relating to tax appeals, it's a matter of statewide concern, and the General Assembly can describe how appeals are taken, and there's some statutes that do that. After the Walgreens decisions, most jurisdictions changed their appeal processes, and then that there were some that didn't happen, and we saw a reiteration of that decision in MDC Holdings versus Town of Parker in 2010. So our legal position still is strong. Of course, one of the things I have to worry about at the Capitol is a bad statute. A statute gets through the legislature that would set up a really unfortunate case for us in the courts. So that's why I got to worry about Simplify Colorado Taxes. Now I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to talk about the current project.
And so now that Jeff has mentioned the political climate we found ourselves in over the last couple of years, the last piece of legislation standing was the Senate Joint Resolution from 2014, which is SJR 38. And that's what gave rise to our Uniform Definitions Project. So what is this project? Effectively, what we're doing is we're reprising and updating the 1992 Model Sales Tax Ordinance, and that provided for standardized definitions back in 1992. So we're reprising that project and we're updating the definitions. As you might imagine, a Watts line doesn't have the same necessity or pervasive use now as it did in 1992. So we're updating those definitions, and we also added some definitions like digital products. That clearly wasn't contemplated by the group in 1992. And what's the object of this Uniform Definitions Project? Well, it's a consensus project. It's driven by a steering committee of municipal tax professionals. They've all agreed to adopt these uniform definitions after working on them extensively. Once we have a package of definitions, the next step is to identify some body to issue the tax guidance and to maintain standardized definitions over time. This was an essential piece of the 1992 package that we didn't do, that we didn't put in place. And as a result, we've seen some drift. We've seen municipalities that got lobbied by special interest directly to the council, so they changed their definition a little bit. We've seen municipalities that, for whatever reason, had an industry or a need to add a definition, and so they added that definition without it going through a sort of standardization process. So those are a couple of things that we're doing differently in 2015 that we didn't do in 1992. So we're learning from our mistakes, and we're making this better as we go along. Why is the standardized definitions project important? It's really important for the reasons that Jeff just explained. Our system is complicated in Colorado. So let's try to simplify tax collection for retailers whenever and wherever it's possible. As you might imagine, it's maddening when neighboring jurisdictions where one particular industry is doing business, when they define terms differently. So your tax liability is different depending on which city you're doing business in. You can only imagine if your business is based in Denver, you also do business in Inglewood and Centennial and Westminster, and each one of those jurisdictions define the exact same thing differently. You can appreciate that this is a difficult thing for business. So if we have standardized definitions, maybe we can reduce some of the complexity. One of the things that's really important to bear in mind as we're doing this project is the business community is our partner. The business community collects the tax for us and remits it to the local jurisdiction. When local business does well, local government does well. So we really need to look at them as our partner. To that extent, and to the extent that we can simplify the collection of tax without sacrificing revenue, then let's do it.
Okay, the next slide illustrates it's sort of a hybrid with the political stuff I was talking about earlier. Like I mentioned, I've spent a lot of my career defending this tax system, and much of the complexity in our tax system is not hard to defend. But for example, our control of our tax base. A lot of people howl about all the differences between the state and local sales tax base. Well, it isn't because local governments figured out a whole lot of new stuff to tax. It's because the General Assembly, which has a income tax to run the state with, can afford to be therefore particularly generous with sales tax exemptions. So over the years, they've given all these breaks to various special interests and watered down their tax base. Well, we can't afford all those exemptions, and we don't want to be stuck with a state base, and it would be financially devastating for us to be stuck with a state base. So that's not a hard case to make for me. Same with audits. The business community is often complaining about, the revolving door with a lot of auditors coming in and making it hard for them to conduct business. Well, I think a couple of years ago, the State Department of Revenue had fewer auditors for the state than Denver deploys in the city and county of Denver. So it's quite obvious that the Department of Revenue is understaffed from an auditing point of view, and we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen this in the experience of jurisdictions that go to local collection without changing their tax rate or their tax base. Only local auditing is the variable. So those things I can defend. What's hard to defend is that, like Rachel was saying, are different definitions. It's hard to defend why each jurisdiction ought to be able to defend prescription drugs in their own idiosyncratic way. As I said earlier, our position and the position of our elected officials over the years is we can figure out a way to get rid of this kind of complexity without, getting hammered financially in the bargain. We ought to do it. And in Senate Senate Joint Resolution 38, the General Assembly furthermore asked us to do it. And so it's a good idea to do. That's the right thing to do. The General Assembly asked us to do it. If with all of that lining up, we don't do it, we're just asking for one of our enemies to come along and use that as leverage to run a constitutional amendment that'll give us a whole lot more trouble than just definitions.
Jeff does a really good job of representing municipal interests down at the Capitol, but it's nearly impossible to ask him to defend these complexities in our systems. And so to the extent that we can, let's simplify. we have a responsibility to address the issue. And again, it's not something that we're just being paranoid about. Look to Arizona. Look to the bills that were introduced to run a constitutional amendment. Look to this group, which is Simplify Colorado Sales Tax. We have some real vulnerabilities in our system. If we don't follow through on our commitment that we made in Senate Joint Resolution 38, it adds fuel to the fire of these folks with an axe to grind against local collection. And there's the potential for major repercussions if we don't.
We just want to be very forthright about this. I mean, this project there's a lot of political motivation for it, but it's sort of in the stitch in time saves 9 department as far as we're concerned. We are reasonable on this, and it enables us to more easily say no on other things where we need to say no. Rachel, why don't you go ahead now and talk about the project itself?
So perfect. So one of the things that I've been working on this year is the process for developing these standardized definitions. I have a steering committee of 23 municipal tax representatives from Grand Junction to Colorado Springs to Evans. So I've got distribution across the state. I've got representation from mountain communities, from Denver, the largest municipality in Colorado, and I've also got small communities that are represented. I've also had subcommittees that we created to address specific definitions like telecom or software, or we had one really hefty subcommittee that addressed all the medical definitions, because again, this isn't happening in a vacuum. If you address one of the medical definitions, oh look, over here in medical supplies, we need to use the same terms. And so they looked at all those medical definitions together. Where it was necessary, they reached out to industry and they said, how do you want us to address this issue? How does this work for you? And so between the steering committee and the subcommittee, these folks have been working really hard. The debt of gratitude that I owe these members of the steering committee and the subcommittees is huge. We've met nearly 10 times since the beginning of the year. When we meet, it tends to be a marathon and not a sprint. We tend to meet all day long. And so I don't know if any of you guys have ever dealt with sales tax all day long in nearly 10 sessions, but I'm telling you, these folks have been working really, really hard, and I really appreciate it. And we've also been working well together, I think, is the other piece that's important. Each jurisdiction is representing themselves, and they're also representing all the tax professionals in the state that locally collect. And so we've had a lot of really interesting conversations, and we've had a lot of really good dialogue, and we've asked the hard questions, and it hasn't always been the quickest process, but we've arrived at some good answers. How have we gotten these definitions? Well, we looked to a few things to provide guidance. We typically started with whatever the 1992 model definition was. We've been through all those model definitions. For the most part, we updated those definitions. We tried to provide clarity for those definitions. If there's something that's come up since 92, we tried to address it in the 2015 definition. The other thing that we looked to was the state definition. Several of our communities just adopted the state definitions when they went home rule. And so that's one of the places that we had to look. And then where it was possible, we tried to synchronize with the state definition. The other thing that we did was we looked at the Streamlined Sales Tax Project. This is a national effort. It's called SSTP, Streamlined Sales Tax Project. So again, we took into consideration 1992 definitions, which most of the home rule locally collecting jurisdictions had in their tax code. We looked to the state definition, and we looked to the SSTP definitions. We also had a conversation about revenue impacts. Obviously, local revenue impacts under Tabor are important. That was something else that we took into consideration when coming up with these definitions. So the next steps, where do we go next? So where we go next will be, CML has a standing committee. It's called the Sales Tax Simplification Committee. all of the nearly 70 home rule jurisdictions that locally collect are represented on this committee, and we meet on an ad hoc basis. So the next steps will be, once we have a finalized package of definition, the very next step will be to get buy-in and to get adoption or a commitment to adopt from our standing sales tax simplification committee. One of our next steps will also be vetting this through legal. I have a number of municipal attorneys that specialize in tax, and they've agreed to look at these definitions, and then we intend to have a conversation. Did we do this right? Can we adopt these? Are these clear definitions? Can we adopt these without running afoul of Tabor? These are big concerns. We think that we can do it. I think that I can do it. My steering committee thinks that I can do it, but we want to make sure we vetted this thing really well. The other group that we want to include in this process is the business community. We want the business community to know what we've done, and we want them to see this as a win, and we want them to celebrate this win with us. We want them to know that we're trying to clarify the definitions, we're trying to standardize the definitions, and we're trying to deal with any potential complexities. The next slide. Thank you. All right, so what standards are being applied to the standardized definitions? And the big question is, what does success look like for us? Well, once your community has adopted the standardized definition, success looks to us a lot like tax treatment of businesses in your community remains the same. We don't anticipate that when you adopt standardized definitions, you start treating your existing local businesses differently in any way. That's not what we're going for here. We're also looking for no significant revenue impact for local government. Again, we're not trying to get you guys to take a bath on certain definitions and lose a bunch of revenue. We're also not looking for you guys to kill a fat hog. Well, we weren't taxing this before, but these 2015 standardized definitions really present a great opportunity to fill the coffers. That's not what we're doing here. The other thing that we're looking to do here is not to make your council or your town board have to go to a Tabor election in order to approve these standardized definitions. Under the Mesa County case, we're allowed to have a de minimis revenue impact. What de minimis means, according to the Mesa County case, is if the cost to hold an election is more than the net revenue increase, then you may make this tax policy change. Again, we're all conditioned under Tabor to think no tax policy change without an election. There's one big caveat hanging out there, one big safe harbor hanging out there, which is if it's a de minimis revenue increase, then you can do it. The next slide, please. Okay, perfect. We're on the next slide. Great. So what happens once the package is complete? This will happen very soon, potentially in the next couple of weeks. We'll have a completed standardized package of definitions. We've closed about 90 definitions. If any of you all have had the pleasure or unfortunate distinction of going to the Joint Budget Committee hearings, we sort of modeled our system on the JBC hearing, where they'll propose, a line item to the budget, they'll then advertise it, they'll put it in the agenda, and then at the very next meeting, everyone votes to close that item. Once it's closed, it's closed and it takes pretty big action to revisit it. So we've closed about 90 definitions. We've got 5 to go in the next 2 weeks. The next step is that we'll start our roadshow. This is part of it, right? We want to make sure that all the home rule locally collecting jurisdictions know what we've done, know why we're doing it, and know why we're urging them, we're begging, we're pleading, pretty please, to adopt these standardized definitions that will fit your base. Now, in a package of 95 definitions, there's not a need to adopt every single definition. If your municipality doesn't have an airport in it, then you've never defined an airplane part, then there's no need to adopt a definition for airplane part now. This is kind of a choose your own adventure with these 95 standardized definitions. It's not a mandate to adopt every single one. The other consideration is if you've always exempted prescription drugs, for example, then our expectation is that you'd continue to exempt prescription drugs in your jurisdiction. You'd amend both your base and your exemptions in tandem so that you treat your local businesses the same as you've always treated them in terms of their tax liability.
Okay, Rachel, I'll do these next ones, right?
Sure.
One of the things that's really exciting to me about this definitions project is what it means for tax simplification down the road. As I mentioned earlier, tax base variations don't affect a lot of vendors. If you're American Furniture Warehouse, couches are taxable every place. There's no funny definition of couch or furniture that affects your commodity. So standardization of definitions isn't going to do a lot for a guy in the furniture business. But what will do a lot for that guy is where the definitions lead us. As I mentioned earlier, some of our existing software already enables a retailer to very accurately determine in which combination of taxing jurisdictions a delivery or sale is being made. And some of those databases are already starting to load tax rate information onto the database. So you could tell not just what jurisdiction you're in, but what the various and aggregate tax rate is for that address. Once standardized definitions are utilized, then a tax matrix becomes possible where you can load tax base information onto that same database. So you can tell what is taxable and what's exempt in a particular address. Obviously that is impossible if you're dealing with different definitions of prescription drugs or something. You just can't get out of the blocks. But once you have uniform definitions, you can populate these databases that way. This also facilitates electronic filing of taxes. We already have electronic filing of taxes in individual jurisdictions. So the real holy grail of tax simplification over the years has been the ability to file taxes for multiple jurisdictions through a single point. I think that we're getting very close to being able to do that. My tax professionals tell me that the two main reasons for staff time spent on tax processing are math errors and incomplete filings. Electronic filing is very advantageous to us because we avoid both of those. You know, you don't populate the fields, you can't hit submit, and there are no math errors because the computer does all the math. So, and we wouldn't give up much in terms of control by enabling vendors, multi-jurisdictional vendors, to process their returns through a single portal. Another exciting possibility that sort of goes along in tandem with this is the possibility of tax licensing through a single site online. You know, now the vendor has to go to 12 jurisdictions and get a tax license and fill out a form that it asks for basically the same information for all 12 jurisdictions. It just seems to us that is something else where we could do some pretty helpful stuff in terms of a single site for applications. It's not going to be simple. All this stuff is incredibly complicated. But things that were sort of hell no for most of my career are now becoming possible because of the digital age. Let's see, what else do I need to say about all of that, Rachel? I guess that's it. I can tell you, I'll just talk about the business community here. They continue to be very supportive of this project. They were supportive of SJR 38. The sort of with it, the people that are paying attention to this are very supportive of uniform definitions and realize what that will get them. You know, there's an element in the business community that just wants state collected, locally shared, state based, no local auditing, and so on and so forth. Well, we're going to go down swinging agree to that ever. But central remittance, while we retain local authority over auditing and collection and so on and so forth, that I think that's an exciting step that this uniform definitions thing opens for us.
And consistency is really the key here. Clarity and consistency has really been one of the overarching messages that we've tried to reflect in these standardized definitions. And obviously that's something that directly aligns with the concerns of the business community.
We wanted to close out here with a sort of cautionary note, just because we've been getting a lot of questions about this group, Simplify Colorado Taxes. And like I say in the slides here, as long as I've been working on this, there have been certain groups like American Furniture Warehouse and the Automobile Dealers Association, principally, that have been just real unhappy about our tax system and just they're not real interested in these uniform definitions projects and standardizing the exempt purchaser affidavits and all these, they view all these steps as a little too incremental, a little too slow. They just want their change and they want it now. And they, like I said earlier, they seem to be mostly focused on creating a forum for complaining on their website, which I would encourage all of you to check out. It's a sobering place to go. And
and their website is www.simplifycosalestalks.com.
Thanks, Rach. That's great. I don't know. Like I said, I hope I'm wrong, but it looks like they're going to do something big at the Capitol. We're, of course, going to be arguing, hey, legislature, in 2014, you gave us some instruction. You asked us to take on a huge project, and we've been doing that in good faith and working with everybody else in the business community, and it's not right for you to change horses in midstream and do something a lot more aggressive and confrontational. But we wanted to mention that to you because this is the context in which Rachel's project, all of our project, continues to go forward.
So that's that's the prepared material that we have for today. And obviously one of the things that we want to do is answer questions. We've got just over 10 minutes to answer questions. One of the questions that I was able to see real quick was, what's our timeline? That's a great question. The Senate Joint Resolution 38 does have some timetables associated with it. And we need to get this done, so we need to have standardized definitions and a body that will provide guidance and will provide any new definitions. This needs to be done by the end of 2015. So that's the timeline. In terms of our standardized definitions, we're about 2 weeks away. At that point, we'll vet it through the Sales Tax Simplification Committee of CML, which is made up of all the locally collecting home rule jurisdictions. We'll vet it through a group of municipal attorneys that specialize in tax. We'll also vet it with the business community, Casey, the Retail Council, and the Chambers of Commerce. And at that point, late this year, early next year, that's the timeline that we're looking to have you guys. We hope that you start to have this conversation with your elected officials sooner rather than later, that you contemplate adoption sooner rather than later, but that you do get this adopted early next year.
We have some stuff to do in the committee before the package goes out, however. We have to figure, as I mentioned earlier, that Rachel indicated the definitions part of this is almost done, but that doesn't, we still have the tax policy piece to identify. And then we also have the very challenging piece about how we're going to maintain all of this over time. You know, how our future city councils, when all of us are gone, going to realize that there was a deal made here and that there's a compact to maintain standardization of these definitions, and that would be defeated by somebody going off and writing their own definition for some local political reason. So we're wrestling with that. That's not simple, and we're going to get a lot of input, a lot of advice, and that'll be part of the package.
I had a question, it looks like that someone sent over just generally on Tabor concerns. So let me do Tabor in 30 seconds if that's possible. Obviously, Tabor requires an election before there's any tax increase or an extension of an existing tax. Tabor also requires voter approval for any debt. Before the municipality issues debt, you have to get authorization from voters. And then the third thing is any tax policy change resulting in a net revenue increase. So that's the piece that we're really looking at here. And because of that Mesa County decision a few years ago, Mesa County allows for there to be a de minimis revenue increase. What that de minimis revenue increase is defined as under Mesa County is if the tax revenue increase is less than the cost of holding an election. And again, so we're dealing hopefully with very small numbers here, and those are sort of the ways that we think that we can work with Tabor on this, on adopting these standardized definitions. And then there's a question here about if we've worked with particular vendors or out-of-state tax software collectors.
No.
We also have a question. Is there some place where we can view the definitions? Well, we've been working on the definitions. Anyone who's on the steering committee has a copy of the definitions. Also, our sales tax simplification committee, they've also taken at least a first glance at some of the definitions. They're not finalized yet. We haven't sent them out and just wallpapered all of you with them yet.
However,
if you want to see a draft copy, shoot me an email.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Plus, remember, every home rule jurisdiction that locally collects its tax has a representative on the sales tax committee. So you've been getting updates on it that way, as well as Rachel's steering committee.
Doug in Littleton, I see your question. If you'll just shoot me an email to rallen@cml.org, I'm happy to provide that information to you. And then just one last reminder is I know that all of you all are here because of your love of sales tax and you just love hearing Jeff and I talk about it, but you can also get CLE credit for attending this. So if you need CLE credit, again, on the right-hand part of your screen should be a big tool box or kind of in a column format. If you'll click on handouts, you'll find the CLE form, or if you're not interested in paper like me, you can go to cletrack.com and enter the course ID 749671 and get your 1 general credit. If you're also interested in a very short summary of what it is we've been talking about today, also go to that handouts tab in the toolbar on the right column. And you'll see on page 3 of one of our CML newsletters provides a real quick summary of what we've been talking about.
And the other thing I wanted to add here is I know from doing this in '92 that as each jurisdiction looks at adopting these things, there are going to be questions about its application in your jurisdiction, and we expect that that's going to be a whole nother phase of this project. It's going to involve a lot of involvement with individual jurisdictions over this. As Rachel mentioned, we're trying to write these so no Tabor election is required to adopt them, so the business community will not experience any new tax treatment that would cause them to get upset and want to go to court, for example. And that we ourselves in local government don't sustain any revenue losses or gains that would cause us trouble, meeting our bond commitments and our other obligations on the one hand, or require us to have a Tabor election on the other.
Any final questions before we sign off? Please speak now. And of course, feel free to follow up with Jeff and I directly. Thank you so much for joining us today.